Welcome to Regulate Tech and to our 31st episode. We have talked a lot about how technology policy more and more needs to be embedded in global agreements and different kinds of new institutions. But there are a couple of examples, interesting examples from history of such conventions and treaties that are worthwhile looking more closely at to understand how they work, what they did, and what we might be seeing in the future. One of the perhaps most foundational ones, and this sort of brings us back to a theme we've had in this podcast of reading foundational texts, is the so-called Budapest Cybercrime Convention, or the Budapest Convention. So Richard, introduce us to the Budapest Convention. What was it? When did it come into force? And what was the impetus behind it?
So the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime is actually a document, a product of something called the Council of Europe. And we've just got to remind ourselves here again that the Council of Europe is not the European Union, nor is it the European Council, which is part of the European Union. Then the names get very confusing here. But the Council of Europe is actually an older body that essentially is the sort of administrative entity for the European Convention on Human Rights adopted after the Second World War. So again, just reminds our history. Second World War, on the back of that, a whole bunch of different human rights instruments were drawn up. Obviously, Europe was the focus because that's where the war had been. And they created this Convention on Human Rights, and then they created a kind of parallel body that goes with it, that kind of acts as a forum whereby all the countries get together that are signatories to this convention.
And this was in 1949, wasn't it? I think
49, I think, when this sort of creature was created. And so the Council of Europe has sort of carried on, and broadly speaking, they include sort of countries that have a presence on the European landmass. I was just reading the other day a debate about whether Kazakhstan should be admitted to membership, and apparently it has some territory west of the Volga River and therefore counts. Anyway, but it is the countries that we traditionally associate with the European Union and indeed Europe beyond the European Union, plus countries of Central and Eastern Europe, sort of outside the European Union, excluding Belarus. You'd be delighted to hear, because Belarus applied to be a member of it, but then refused to get rid of the death penalty. And one of the conditions of being in this club is that you don't have the death penalty. And so Belarus, I think, probably sort of preempted their own expulsion by refusing to reform, and therefore is not sort of part of it. But then, Russia's part of it. Turkey's part of it. These are all signatories to the Council of Europe.
Yes, and it's interesting in a way because we'll get to this, but the Council of Europe has produced a number of different treaties, and it's one of the organizations that has the sort of shortest to treaty time, in a sense that it can create a treaty draft fairly quickly, and then of course it takes time to get it into final treaty format, and even more time for the countries to ratify it. I think we should talk a little bit about what a treaty is, and you don't have to be a member of the club to be a signatory of the treaty, do you?
You don't, and that's what's sort of interesting here. So they did, yes, they spent 4 years sort of debating this question and saying we should have a convention. Cybercrime is growing in importance. And remember, this is 2001, so they're kind of ahead of the pack. And we'll get onto this later, but there is a new proposal before the United Nations, which is at the other end of the spectrum in terms of time taken. There's a new proposal over the last couple of years, which has been debated there, but 20 years later than this original one. So 4 years, end of the 1990s, they're debating it. As you say, Nicklas, this is like super speedy. The advantage, obviously, the Council of Europe has is because essentially the foundational principles, there is a kind of common constitution in this European Convention on Human Rights as administered by the European Court of Human Rights. So they're a sort of reasonably tightly knit club, which is one advantage in terms of drafting something, because they can say, look, there are provisions on things like surveillance. Well, we're all under the same provisions of a human rights convention when it comes to privacy, and therefore we can reach agreement on language around surveillance and an international agreement on surveillance more easily than others might. So they're able to do that. The treaty document simply says, look, we've agreed that this is a text that countries could adopt. And until countries formally ratify it and say, yes, we're prepared to be a party to it, it has no meaning, sort of advisory until people formally ratify it. And then there are provisions within it that says, look, when a certain number of countries have ratified it, it now comes into force. And coming into force essentially means that somebody could seek to take action against a party in terms of international law, and that's not something I'm going to pretend to be an expert on exactly how they do that. But at least theoretically, if a country has signed up to an international treaty, formally ratified it, and has not kind of de-acceded from that treaty, then there would be some way to hold that country accountable under international law, and varying degrees of how effective that might be in practice. But in theory, you can hold them accountable for the fact they breached the treaty. Now, say the advantage of this sort of European-ish club, and they've got observers from other places like sort of US and Canada, but the advantage of the European-ish club doing this is their starting point was kind of fairly similar, and they could do this quickly. Big disadvantage is all the other countries in the world who are saying, look, hang on a minute, your cozy little European club has come up with this thing, but you didn't ask us what we thought. And so there's a whole bunch of other countries, and this has been the real limitation of the Budapest Convention, is that other countries, notably, very major economies like Brazil and India, have always sort of felt this is sort of unfair that they should be asked to sign up to something that they didn't actually get to shape, given well, in India, it is bigger than all of the European Union. I don't know, by the time you throw in the other Council of Europe member states, maybe not, but it's pretty sizable.
Oh, it's still
Brazil,
bigger. It's 820 million people in the Council of Europe countries, and India beats them hands down. So there you go.
There you go. They're sort of bigger than the entirety of the Council of Europe, and yet they weren't party to this. And they've sort of been in and out. So the downside, to say, is that it's upside, it's done quickly. Downside, it may not get international acceptance. And that's kind of the status we've been in. Interestingly, though, even one of the countries that is a member of the Council of Europe, that is a big player, and will definitely feature in the new discussion, Russia, declined to sign up to the treaty that its own, in a sense, its own organization had created. And their refusal to sign up was because they saw the treaty as in some way infringing on their own sovereignty. At least that was the argument they put forward. So even though they're a party to its negotiation, even though they're part of the Council of Europe, Russia says, but we're not willing to compromise our sovereignty in any way by signing up to a treaty that might force us to engage in some kind of international investigations or processes that we don't think that we should have to agree to, or that over which we won't retain in sort of pure Russian control.
So we need to take a few steps back here. I feel we need to lay out the argument for why people felt that they needed to have a convention or a treaty on cybercrime. Let's talk about that. What's the motivating force here? It's 2001. This is when this was written. It was sort of prepared a couple of years before that. People were starting to see something in their environment, starting to realize something about the fundamental nature of the internet, and that was what drove this. What is it that they're starting to see?
So they're starting to see. A few things that are driving this. So this is the time. Remember, late 1990s. The internet is moving from being this sort of academic thing to a mass consumer product, and it's that shift to it being a mass consumer product that then triggers all of this. And there are certain harms that they can see arising, which are harms that are being done from one country to another over the internet. And that's why they need the Cybercrime Convention, because it's not something they realize they can deal with in domestic law. If the person committing the crime is in France and the victim is in the Netherlands, the only way that the Dutch authorities protecting those victims in the Netherlands can kind of get any satisfaction is if France has put in place laws that would allow that person to be prosecuted. And they saw some gaps. And the areas where they looked at were, so they talk about this sort of harmonizing domestic criminal law to make sure that certain things are offenses everywhere. So the first thing that they look at is a whole set of offences related to computers themselves, and this is what.
This is really important.
Yeah,
let's sort of just dig into that a bit, because if you're in country A and you commit an act that's defined as a crime in country B, but not in country A, then there is no chance whatsoever that you'll get any legal assistance. That's sort of the very foundation for any legal assistance from one country to another, is that they have the same definition of the criminal act, right? That's really right. Important, and it's easy to overlook, but it's a fundamental thing, right?
It is, and at this time, again, we've got to remember that in many countries of the world, there was no law making it illegal to do what in the common parlance is called hacking, but we hate that word, don't we, Nicholas? Because hacking
It is
is
very bad.
is
Hacking is
is
nice.
many
Cracking
things.
is
Hacking
bad.
is good. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Hacking, in fact, people may be aware the Facebook headquarters is on a road which they named Hacker Way, because hack is part of the culture. Because again, hacking is also used as a sort of jargon or slang for finding a different way to do things in computer code.
Mhm.
So it's not about necessarily gaining unauthorized access to other people's computer systems. So we should probably just call it by that, because and the convention does focus on that, like, accessing somebody else's computer system without permission. You haven't been granted access, but you kind of find a sneaky way in. That's the first thing that they kind of want to deal with, because they're starting to see that happen. People are, they're the sort of famous, it starts to get into the movies and things, the famous stuff of people accessing, I don't know, the NASA systems or the American Department of Defense. And you start to see these sort of hacking attacks, as they tend to get called, but really are attempts to gain unauthorized access to computer systems. And in many countries of the world, back then, 20 plus years ago, you go and you say, this your person in your country tried to get into my defense systems, and they go, well, nothing in our law says that you can't do that, because we haven't legislated for it, and so nothing there. And so the first thing the treaty does is it says, look, if you sign up to the treaty, you're making a commitment to pass a domestic law that outlaws that kind of unauthorized access, baseline kind of thing. And then it goes on with some other provisions that sort of add to that, and so building the tools that allow people to do unauthorized access, and various other forms of kind of interference with computer systems will also be illegal.
So the first level of the motivation behind the Budapest Convention was, let's agree on what's unlawful here. Let's agree on what actually constitutes a crime in some way. So we can start then looking at what is the second piece here, which is how do we help each other to combat those crimes.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, it's let's commit to all agreeing to make certain activities illegal, and this isn't, again, we should be clear, it's not without controversy, and there are some extensions. So just to sort of flesh out some of the controversy, part of it is, sort of makes what, again, in the slang people might call hacking tools, but basically computer code that could be used to gain access to other people's systems. And when we call it a virus, something that is sort of gets backdoor access to a system, I think we'd all kind of reasonably comfortable that's a bad thing, sort of pushing viruses out. But there's a thing called penetration testing, which is what good guys do, computer security people do, where they try and test whether or not they can gain access to a system. And so there was actually a reasonable amount of controversy saying, look, hang on a minute, if you're saying it's illegal to possess software that does these things, in some cases you may be also sweeping up the good guys, and that there has to be a sort of reasonable defense that yes, you've got some software that allows you to break into systems, but you're doing that for the right reasons, not for the wrong reasons. So there's a bit of controversy there.
And on that controversy, I think it's important to remember that it plays out against the background of a ginormous debate about cryptography that we just had at the end of the 90s, where possession of certain encryption tools, according to some proposals that were circulating at the time, should be criminalized. Just having access to those tools would in itself be a crime. Or exporting those tools, essentially exporting math, as it were.
Yeah.
It was something that people wanted to criminalize. So the entire community of tech policy people and computer scientists and people who were working in human rights law were very, very sensitive to the notion that possession of software, be it encryption software, penetration testing software, or any other kinds of tools, in any way, shape, or form should be construed as a crime. So that was one of the roots of the controversy was that the idea that possession of math or of software should be criminalized just didn't sit right with people.
That's right, and we should, there's a sort of fair degree of hypocrisy involved as well here, because as we now know from the Snowden revelations and all the stories around this Israeli company NSO, that of course the governments were buying all of this technology and deploying all of these tools to gain unauthorized access to people's systems, but they're doing it as good guys rather than as bad guys. So there's sort of an element as well of it's okay for you to do it, it's not okay for us to do it. What's going on here? And that also as well spreads into, there are other areas where today, I mean, there's a lot of talk about these ransomware attacks. To be clear, this is actually where the convention's quite far-sighted, because it does think about that. It actually uses language about, getting access to systems and deleting or corrupting or doing sort of dodgy stuff with the data once you're inside. So it's not just accessing the system; it's messing around with the data when you're in there, which is exactly what a ransomware attacker does. So again, if countries signed up to the convention and they implemented these laws properly, they will have the kind of laws that they need on the books in order to deal with ransomware people, because that is squarely in the sights of what this was aiming at, like gaining access to systems and doing dodgy things in there. So there's one other area that I think is worth just pausing for a moment on, where I think again it could be quite controversial, and that's what are known as denial of service attacks, which again are the classic kind of thing that they were trying to go after, which is where you try and make a service inaccessible using technical means. The classic thing is what they call a distributed denial of service attack, where you basically get hundreds of thousands of computers to all go and ask for a website for its data at the same time. So you're not trying to break into the website. You're not trying to do anything with their data. You're just overloading it with lots and lots of requests, but very deliberately, because you know that if you overload their server, no one else can get there. Again, most circumstances we would kind of go, well, yeah, I think that's right. That should be criminalized. But there have been instances, including quite recently, where, for example, it's a racist website that's propagating racist hate speech. And, it's hosted in a country where they refuse to take any action over it. And activists will get together and do what they would think of as good denial of service, because they're trying to make this sort of thing inaccessible. And nowadays you can sometimes buy technology. There's a company called Cloudflare, which, if you see them in the news, they're a very popular one, which will kind of protect sites against these denial of service attacks. But again, if you're like a deeply unpleasant far-right racist outfit, then it may well be that Cloudflare has refused to do business with you as well. And so you can actually take these sites down. Again, a little bit dual use and quite a large element of judgment. Are you saying denial of service should always be criminal, and the intent of the convention is to make sure that you're always able to be prosecuted? Or is there good denial of service and bad denial of service, like there's good hacking and bad hacking? But those are sort of judgment questions, I think, that come out of any agreement of this nature.
Yeah, so we're looking at the motivations here, and the first thing we found was that we need to agree on what actually constitutes harm and illegal behavior, and that's one part of the convention. And really getting to the heart of that can be controversial, because you need to take some really hard decisions. But the next motivation, the next reason that this was an important convention, was that there's something changing with the nature of evidence, right?
That's right.
And
yeah.
so
Please. Yeah, so the bulk of it. So, and we should just though reflect. There's one other little bit as well. Just it's as well as the computer-related offences, they did try and create a level playing field around a common set of offences which they sort of saw as being commonly carried out across border, and those are fraud, forgery, child abuse images, and are always our favorite illegally copied copyright material. So again, just there was the computer offences bit, which was sort of novel and in many cases wasn't legislated for, and then they did sort of pick out a few elements. And again, we may come on later to talk about the new Russian-driven proposal for a United Nations convention, which is along similar lines. And what you'll see there is the Russians just add a much longer list of offences where they say, look, everyone should have laws,
but
some
partly
kind of level playing field in that.
The motivation behind adding those sort of existing crimes was that the nature of the evidence was changing. So if you're talking about cross-border fraud, right, then suddenly something happens if you're doing it with the help of a computer.
That's right. So then that brings us on to the sort of real judicial meat of it, which says, look, for these new hacking offences, for this category of offences that we've picked up on as very likely to be cross-border and happening over the internet, we need a bunch of agreements where we will cooperate with each other about data, and so there are requirement, or there are somewhere between sort of requirement and guidance. It's kind of saying, you should have stuff in place, not in painful detail, but along these lines that would permit and enable you to do certain things, and those include things like looking at traffic data, which commonly, or subscriber data, which would identify people doing things. That there's language around surveillance, collecting data, and how that should be possible in some cases. And then there's a lot of language. Also, there's language around search. So searches, which we sometimes like neglect a little in cyber world, but when you've actually got a serious investigation going on, you go and find the premises where the computers are and you search them just like you would search for illegal drugs or anything else. I mean, you're going and doing a digital search. So there's provisions around interception, capturing traffic data, search, and then a bunch of provisions that kind of say, and here's how we'll do cross-border cooperation in all of these areas. So ways for governments to ask for mutual assistance from other governments. There's actually a provision on governments sort of voluntarily providing data to other governments when they've come across something in their investigation that's interesting to a third country. So there's lots and lots about how one should sort of exchange data.
And we should disentangle these, I think, because one thing here is that the nature of the evidence is changing. It's becoming more ephemeral. It's more important, for example, to be able to preserve evidence, to make sure that you timestamp digital evidence, because by its very nature, it's easy to tamper with anything that's digitally stored. And so preserving it, making sure that it's not deleted or that it doesn't disappear is sort of figures largely in the minds of the people sitting down to draft this convention. And then on top of that, I think one of the realizations that ultimately drive a lot of this too is that, of course, countries have faced this problem before when it comes to fraud. Of course, they've seen the challenge of cross-border criminal activity before, but the tools that they had to resolve that were so incredibly inept when it came to digital crimes that suddenly they realized that they needed something entirely new. Because let's just walk through how you would typically do something like ask the US for assistance in a legal investigation before you had some kind of collaboration between countries in a treaty or some committee agreement. There's something called a mutual legal agreement, a mutual legal assistance treaty, an MLAT, the
That's
MLAT.
Right.
So that was what you had recourse to before you had any faster means. So what's an MLAT?
Yeah, so these are. I mean, this sort of principle goes way back. So somebody, I don't know, committed a murder in the UK and hopped on a transatlantic boat, 100 years ago, sort of went back to the US. There may have been a requirement. You want to get that person back, so you start developing law around things like extradition. But you may also want to get evidence. It may be that you need to carry out a search of the premises where those people are in the United States in order to investigate a crime that took place in the United Kingdom. And from a United States point of view, in that case, they don't have probable cause or any good reason to go and search somebody's premises in respect of any victim in the United States. There's no complainant there saying I've got a problem, but there is somebody in the UK. And so they developed these mechanisms essentially over the years for the authorities in the UK to effectively apply to a court in the United States, who are the only people who can actually authorize a search in the territory of the United States, to say, hey, court of the United States, we would like you to search this premises to find evidence that's useful in our court case back in the UK, because we've got victims here that need satisfaction. And so you sort of, out of that mechanism, you build a whole legal structure. While the sort of crimes are few and far between, these things work. But then you get to a point which is a recurrent problem that you've got now, which is that if the crimes are happening at scale and you need a lot of evidence to be collected, for example, to assist your case, then the courts just get backed up. And again, just think of this dynamic that it could be happening in all different directions, but essentially a court is being asked to sort of set aside time and make an effort to issue a search warrant or whatever it is, provide some data, get hold of something to assist a third country. And it's actually got a backlog of crimes taking place in their own country with their own victims. So, like, which are you going to prioritize? Let's just be honest. Like, it's human nature. Of course, you're going to prioritize the stuff in your own country.
And not only that, because if a court in your home country actually gets you that warrant, so you need a warrant first from your home country to show that you have legal cause in your home country. That's sort of one of the bases of an MLAT. Then you have to take it to the other country, and it's not sure that you take it to a court in the other country. You may well take it to a small subdivision of the foreign affairs or State Department in the
That's right.
US, for example, who are managing 60 or 70 different MLATs at the same time. And you're required by these MLATs to do this in an extraordinarily paper-bound process. We're talking
Yeah.
facsimiles here, right? Sending them back and forth, and you're filling out. And this is so interesting because there's a detailed form that you're supposed to fill out for an MLAT, and if you miss a detail, you can't just sort of call somebody up and ask because of the sort of rule of law heaviness of but you send the entire form back and say it's not complete. And so this process that could work for a different time with different kinds of evidence and different pace of criminal activity turns out to sort of in the internet age be fairly useless, to be honest.
And this is something that's still not fully resolved. And again, you'll see reports in the press. I mean, very commonly, it's sort of a European judge or police officer or interior minister who's frustrated, typically with the US company, because they say they're not getting the cooperation they want in terms of data needed for investigations, and actually even within Europe itself. So this is a common thing. It's certainly not been resolved. Part of the intent of the convention was to try and give it a boost and put in place, in a sense, a sort of permissive framework. As a signatory to the treaty, you were giving yourself permission to hand over data to other countries when you might not normally do so. But you hit two of these obstacles. One is the bureaucratic one we've just described. These are serious processes of law. They're built on processes of law that were intentionally quite heavy because they're supposed to act as a barrier to handing out data willy-nilly. But you also hit, frankly, sort of sovereignty questions. Some quite significant sovereignty questions. Even if under the treaty, you're permitted to hand data over to other countries, you may not wish to do so. And I think particularly if the data involves your own citizens. So if you think for a minute that the request from the foreign country may well be for data related to a crime that is alleged to have been committed by somebody who's one of your citizens against a citizen in the foreign country. And so you're going to go and say, carry out some kind of search data collection exercise and hand over the data of one of your citizens to the authorities in a third country, who then potentially are going to try and extradite your citizen and kick off a whole sort of prosecution process. That feels uncomfortable a lot of the time, and particularly if there are varying human rights standards between the different countries in question. And you imagine from a governmental point of view, if you did that and some kind of abuse of the human rights of your citizen took place, it was a patently unfair court case they were subjected to, or they're subjected to some kind of hugely disproportionate punishment, that's not going to feel great. And actually, we've seen that really interesting in the UK, with all this structure in place. The way it's supposed to work, go right early in the conversation, is that, a hacker in the United Kingdom, who's hacked computer systems in the US, well, now it is an offense to do that unauthorized access in both countries. And the United States, kind of within this general framework, is perfectly entitled to come to the British authorities and say, we've identified somebody in Britain who's been breaking into the NASA systems or whatever, and we want you to send them here to be prosecuted. And there's been 2 or 3 very, very high profile and controversial cases, really on the basis that, look, I mean, candidly, the people who did the unauthorized access could be very young, not, sort of, one has a certain degree of human sympathy that they may not necessarily have understood the seriousness of what they were doing. It was a game, and they shouldn't have done it, and it's illegal. But you kind of assume, look, in a British court, they will get a punishment. It is illegal. Something's going to happen, but it's not going to be like life imprisonment. You look at the threat that they're under in the United States, and it's life imprisonment in one of these sort of evil high security penitentiaries somewhere in Colorado. And there's a lot of sympathy in the UK to say, hey, yeah, they did something wrong, but we don't actually want them extradited. And you've seen 2 or 3 cases sort of dismissed on that basis, even though, as I say, the actual sort of very clear intent of the convention was that countries should be able to haul people across borders who had broken the law on both sides. So quite complex when it comes to actually putting it in place in practice, even though, I say, in theory, it's supposed to be sending a message out saying, look, you're not you're not whatever impervious to prosecution just because you've done it to a system in another country. The local authorities are going to cooperate with them in making sure you're punished.
It highlights a bug in the treaty construction, one could argue, because if you're harmonizing the definitions of what constitutes a crime, not also harmonizing some kind of sort of punishment space or scale, means that you can have wildly different outcomes in different countries. And this is sort of what you're describing with the UK-US case. But if you had harmonized the punishment scale, or sort of the term determination for these crimes as well, or if you had just given a hint of what we think is reasonable, you might actually have had a much easier time to think about extradition. And sort of generally, you wouldn't even have had to do that, because you could take somebody to court in the country where they are, and they could have served their time there to the extent that would have been a part of their verdict. But so let's just recap. So we're bringing people with us. We have identified, I think, at least 3 really important reasons for drafting the Cybercrime Convention. It's the 1990s, and we're seeing that computers are used to engage in stuff that is entirely new, and where we haven't just decided whether it's a crime or not in different countries, and we're trying to harmonize the definitions of what constitutes a crime. Second thing is, we're realizing that in order to have a chance at taking care of these crimes and a number of other already established older crimes, the nature of evidence is changing so fast that if we don't have a good way of collecting evidence, preserving evidence, transmitting evidence, there's not going to be a way to prosecute these crimes, even if we have defined them in the same way. And then thirdly, the old means of collaborating cross-border simply don't cut it anymore. They're sort of not fit for purpose. So we need a convention. And so we're now at the point where we decided that we need the convention, and it needs all of the different provisions that you laid out. What is the main argument against a convention like this? It seems like a reasonable case we're making here. Why was there criticism and controversy, and not just about the individual provisions, but about the treaty as such?
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, as we discussed a little while ago, the starting point was like who drew it up and who got to be part of it. So that's one question of just does the convention reflect your interests? And again, interestingly, there's this new document that's been published under the auspices of the United Nations, which I say was sort of largely Russian originated, and you can see in that the sort of offences they focused on are very different. And so yes, had it been drawn up by a different group of countries, it might have had different areas of emphasis within it. So that's the sort of first criticism: is does it cover the stuff that is your highest priority from a governmental point of view? And then I think the more fundamental sort of question, which is for any country, is are you in fact willing to trust other countries? And this is I guess, a sort of universal thing for treaties generally. And you'd see it in, the Paris Agreement on climate change. It's like, I'm taking some pain here. Do I trust the other countries to honor the agreement and also take some pain? So it's a classic sort of quid pro quo type of agreement. And so I think there are. I mean, Russia was sort of explicit in saying we're not going to enter into a quid pro quo, and we see the sort of ramifications of that failure now, where the suggestion is that quite a few of the people doing these ransomware attacks today are based in Russia, and that there is some kind of, again, Russian government might deny this, but some sort of informal agreement that if people in Russia sort of compromise computer systems outside Russia, they won't get prosecuted. They'll only get prosecuted if they start attacking Russian systems. That's the allegation. And so, we've seen that failure. But there you can see this sort of high level of distrust. And you saw it throughout the US elections between that example, sort of Russia and US. That's explicit, but implicit are all sorts of views that governments take about other governments and whether or not they're properly fulfilling the treaty. And what you don't want in any treaty for it to be lopsided. You've done your bit. You're prosecuting all the bad guys in your country who are compromising the systems in country X. You're willing to extradite people. You're willing to execute search warrants, but the authorities in country X are not playing their part. So I think that's the sort of primary criticism. And then some of these sovereignty questions, I think, again, are real. Are you signing up to a treaty where, if you're operating in good faith, you don't want to have to breach the terms of the treaty, but there may be some fundamental legal rights that your citizens have that will run into conflict with the requirements under the treaty. So if you're going to execute a search warrant or collect data on behalf of a third country, can you do that in a way that is actually consistent with your own domestic legal framework? And if not, does signing the treaty mean you're going to have to go and change a bunch of your laws in order to permit the activities that the treaty obligates you to? And that may be, again, with a lot of treaties, that often is the stumbling block. That in other areas, there's I think, UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, for example. And I know when politicians look at that, it's like, well, if we sign up to that, do we have to change our own legislation in terms of children's rights? So is there a bunch of legislation that we will have to change? Are we willing to do that? And are we compromising our own sovereignty because we're letting someone else dictate the changes we make to our legislation rather than deciding to do it ourselves?
Wasn't there also a line of argument that said if we're going to establish these new crimes and these new methods of collaboration, the level overall in all of these states individually of surveillance and the sort of the correlated effect on individual privacy is going to be quite massive? Because suddenly, instead of just having one nation sort of preserving its laws and surveilling its citizens to a degree that's under democratic oversight in that country, we're going to have all of these different countries go potentially asking about our citizens. That the overall effect of harmonization of something like cybercrime legislation actually leads to a higher tension or pressure on privacy overall.
Yeah, I think that is a concern. Although interestingly, the treaty does talk about illegal interception. So, and again, when we go way back 20 years, you need to remember that quite a few countries did not necessarily explicitly make interception of communications illegal. They would have a very permissive regime. And of course, it suited the authorities in those countries not to do that. So a lot of countries, I mean, the UK really had to tidy its legislation up under something called the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, RIPA. And that was only in the early 2000s. I think that was 2001, about this time. So yes, there was a concern that it would spread, but at the same time, signing up may be one of the first occasions on which some governments would have explicitly been saying, yes, I am going to make it illegal to do interception for the general population. And then I'm going to create a specific regime for governments to do it. And I say that maybe in many cases have been quite a sort of blank area at the time. So there were benefits to the treaty in terms of an explicit commitment to prevent interception, except where legally authorized. But you're right, there's a fear that there would be a lot more requests coming cross-border. Again, I think that's actually been quite interesting. My experience, certainly, I was surprised about how little cross-border activity there was, even with all this sort of stuff being in place. It was not as common as you expected. And I think there's still, even today, there's kind of an assumption that it's just too much hassle for law enforcement authorities to try and investigate things where the perpetrators are in another country, unless it's very, very serious indeed. So that's persistent. So they're not going through the process of requesting data at massive scale from other countries.
No, it's fair, and I think it's also I think we might also say that if you look at cybercrime overall, it's not an unreasonable hypothesis that it somewhat mirrors e-commerce, and we know e-commerce is not that much cross-border because people prefer to actually shop in their own country. It's sort of a general sense of trust and language and all of those different things, and you could almost suspect that cybercrime actually has some kind of similarity in pattern, that it doesn't happen cross-border as much because it's actually easier to commit crime in a context where you're knowledgeable about what works and doesn't work in terms of sort of tricking people. You see attempts now and then of auto-translated phishing emails, for example, but I can't think that they're horribly effective to the vast majority of the people who get them, although there will always be cases, of course. Now, we have sort of looked at the effects. We've looked a little bit at the discussion. We're 20 years down the road. What would you say is let's talk about what you think is the greatest impact that the Budapest Convention has had on tech policy and the way we think about these issues today?
Yeah, I mean, I would have said it's. I think it has enabled a certain level of cooperation that kind of wasn't there. Again, within limits. It's not realised the promise I think that the people who drafted it would have had, that there would be these sort of seamless cross-border investigations. But again, to your point just now, I think and maybe the demand patterns have been a little different from those that were anticipated. So I don't think it's led to that seamless cooperation, but it's created a benchmark. People talk about it. Even the countries like India that didn't want to be a signatory have kind of used it as a reference point. And then interestingly, I think just a couple of years ago, they were saying there was a push for a new UN level convention, which overcomes this sort of European thing. It took place, I think it was driven through the UN General Assembly, and I was just looking at the list of names. At the first on the list, I think, was Belarus, and then it was Russia, Myanmar, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the Bolivarian state of Venezuela, etc. So you imagine that they're countries at the side, but their text, whilst having sort of embellishments that might make you nervous, the core of it is still the Budapest text. So they've sort of wrapped up the Budapest text, a lot of it, with other stuff that, as I say, I think perhaps we should be rightfully sort of nervous about. But it's still the reference point. It's still like, this is the framework that, look, if you're, what are the things you need to fix in order to make law enforcement work in the internet age? Well, they are the things that are in the convention. So I think it did a pretty good job as sort of describing the things you need to fix. And then beyond that, as I say, a lot of it comes back to good old fashioned politics, international relations. You referred earlier to sort of common definitions around punishments and things, but there's also, I think, quite a gap between different countries about how they feel about certain activities. One person's information terrorist is another person's information freedom fighter. So you come back to some of the big exposés we've seen, the Edward Snowden expose, the WikiLeaks files, all of that stuff, which in a sense sort of sits within the framework. Well, there is no consistent international view, I think, on whether those were things that should be prosecuted with the full force of the law or legitimate whistleblowing. And so we're still sort of in that zone of quite a lot of, I think, sort of inconsistency about how people feel about certainly those information-based cyber crimes as opposed to the purely financially motivated ones. And then more recently, we have election interference and misinformation, and again in the new UN text that's sort of kicking around, they try and define misinformation now as one of these things that should be included in the convention. But very widely different views about what should constitute sort of illegal misinformation. So you start to bring that in, everything gets much more complex.
And I think you're right. I mean, it's fair to say that it established an understanding of the problem, sort of a mental model in which a lot of people thought, which was, we have an entirely new set of crimes. We have old crimes being committed with new means. We have a new set of evidence, and our old tools aren't there anymore. This led to collaboration within the European Union and the development of a lot of legislation that enabled law enforcement access and collaboration within the European Union, for example. It led to discussions about comity agreements between different states where they would treat each other's legal law enforcement access equally, and so I think if you want to credit it with something, you could credit it with understanding and laying out the problem. But you can also see in the history of the Budapest Convention how hard it is to extend beyond the basics, because they had a second protocol, didn't they?
They did. They had a protocol on racist and xenophobic speech, which again reflected, I think, the concerns of the Council of Europe at the time, and so that was added on, and probably a sort of pretty consistent view. I mean, actually, the whole thing about racist, xenophobic speech and international agreements is fascinating, because there's a lot of sort of language and protocols that have been put out both through the United Nations and through the Council of Europe, so unequivocally condemning racist and xenophobic speech and calling for its criminalization. And yet there are a number of countries where constitutional rights to freedom of expression would not tolerate the criminalization of speech of that nature, and the United States being the standout example. And so it's one of those curious things where I think everyone would, at a moral level, condemn racist and xenophobic speech, but when it comes to, say, legally criminalizing it, I think there's a lot of very, very divergent views, actually, also including within Europe. Uh, Within Europe, I've done the analysis in the past, and there are some countries like Germany where, just saying something mildly offensive may take you into the realm of criminality, and that there are other countries, I guess Sweden's probably an example, Netherlands, where
Yeah.
the law's quite clear. You can say pretty like wild and offensive things, and no, you're not going to face criminal prosecution for that. And so this protocol was attached on, which basically said, like we've said, that you need to have laws criminalizing illegal copyright material and criminalizing child abuse material. You are also signing up to have laws criminalizing racist and xenophobic speech, which can then be enforced on a cross-border basis. And that, as I say, I think is partly implemented. Those countries that already had laws in, criminalizing racist and xenophobic speech, fine. I'm not sure it's sort of encouraged any others to do so, because, again, back to the sovereignty question, you're not going to change your fundamental constitutional principles on freedom of expression just because you've signed up to a treaty on cybercrime. Like, that doesn't work that way. And so either you won't sign the protocol, or you might sign the protocol with the intent of doing something, but find that your constitutional court tells you can't, and the signatory of the Cybercrime Convention is not enough to overturn X years of jurisprudence that says no, that kind of speech is fine. Or you would just interpret it your own way and say, well, we don't regard that as racist or xenophobic enough, even if you might, and therefore we have got a law that criminalizes it, but only a very, very narrow definition, and that's good enough for the treaty.
Yeah, but I think also shows that it's hard to expand the basic set of things we agree on to especially to speech and information. I think that's a very tricky thing. The other addition that was being at least considered at some time, I think as late as in 2018, was to do more on law enforcement access, but it was sort of overtaken by the work within the European Union and between individual countries. But I think most people realize that there's still a lot of friction in this law enforcement access or assistance work out there, and that's something that we have talked about before, where we believe that that's going to be an area where we'll see more treaty work in the future, but perhaps bilateral rather than multilateral. Or what do you think?
I think so. I think bilateral. I think I've talked about as multi-bilaterals. You need a lot of bilateral agreements, really, because it's so sensitive. The extent to which you're willing to remove friction is very dependent on the specifics of the legal system, the kind of offences you're talking about, and so I'm not sure any country would feel comfortable. I'm not sure we should, all of us, feel comfortable where you get to kind of automated access, or you've removed all the friction. The friction is purposeful, so you don't want too much friction. It's a serious offense. Somebody's in another country, the data's desperately needed or the data's in another country. The people may all be in your country, and these are actually some of the most frustrating cases where the victim and the perpetrator are both, for example, in the UK, but the data that you need to convict the perpetrator is in the US. So there may not be sovereignty issues in that sense, but still you want a certain amount of friction just to make sure that you're not handing over data in a way that would lead to a human rights abuse. But getting that right is very particular to particular countries and particular legal systems. I think has to be negotiated, on a multi-bilateral basis, which I think is feasible if the will is there for people to go and do that. But
No, sorry, which makes this new UN treaty really interesting, because that's an attempt to build a global treaty around something where we think that the Budapest Convention probably reached as far as you could, and what's left now is probably bilateral or regional harmonization. So let's talk a bit about the UN treaty. What except for let's start with the scope of the UN treaty. Yeah. What do you think that will mean?
Yeah, essentially, it takes the Cybercrime Convention, it sort of updates it in other bits. So it has a definition of a botnet in there, which is a very 2021 thing. That wasn't a 2001 thing. But then it throws in a whole list of offences, which again, if you're familiar with Russian internet law, they are very familiar to you. So in Russian law, they're very focused on I mean, again, worthy subjects, but not necessarily criminalized in other areas. Encouragement of self-harm and suicide is one. Encouragement of drug use is another. There are various categories of extremism, which I think are much, much more controversial, because the definition of extremism, certainly as the Russian authorities interpret it, can include, people who are opposed to the government, otherwise known as opposition. And so you can sort of see a whole category of offences in there that reflect the state of Russian law and their sort of priorities. So that's where it may fall down. Then there is this piece about sort of putting out misinformation. There's some stuff in there, which again, they're, depending on where you're sitting, it may be that you're comfortable with the idea you see misinformation as a threat that should be criminalized, or you may be very uncomfortable because you see it as something that can be weaponized. Again, misinformation is the opposition's campaign material and never the government's campaign material. So I think that's what we have to watch out. So say a great big long list of additional provisions, but within a framework that, broadly speaking, is very similar to the original Budapest framework. I think the interesting question from a procedural point of view, and certainly when this was launched, it came out from motion from the General Assembly, which is a sort of majority of member states. I think the United States opposed it. The countries that were already signatories to Budapest, I think, were uncomfortable with this particular method and saw it as not necessarily the most democratic or kind of positive development. There is now a text, but the vote was won, and they've been working on a text. Be interested to see how far it goes. It's possible that it gets pruned back again. It's quite possible it just gets bogged down forever, and it's never actually going to come out because, say, there's so much in there that I think other countries might find difficult to accept. Again, if there's a majority view, similar to the way the Budapest Convention sort of set out. I'm not the world's expert on the UN's internal procedures, but I guess we can get to a point where this thing is published, and then there'll be a coalition of countries that sign up to it, maybe sort of inverse of the Budapest Convention. So the first signatories will be the Russias and countries that are not necessarily part of Budapest. And then we'll have two competing instruments, the UN one and the Budapest one. The Budapest one thinner, a little bit out of date. The UN one maybe too fat, up to date, but too fat in terms of the stuff that's in it and levels of cooperation that might be required.
Yeah, it's a 69-page document to compare with the 22-page document of the Budapest Convention, it seems, and I mean it's a very real opportunity or possibility that it will never go anywhere because they won't get enough traction around it. But even so, it has perhaps served its purpose because it signaled a willingness to discuss this. It sort of answered the question that the Budapest Convention poses: why are you not a signatory to the Budapest Convention? That is, as the Budapest Convention gains more and more signatories over time and becomes more and more established, a more and more pressing question. And one way to answer it, of course, is to launch your own and say, no, we should have this instead. This is a broader one that has the inclusive points that you made in the beginning, which I think are the right points. Everyone should be around the table when you're negotiating something like this. But on the other hand, everyone around the table doesn't really seem to work that well. It's really hard when you're sort of negotiating treaties. So I think that in a sense you can see this new convention as a response to the question being asked by the now 20-year-old Budapest Convention to the people who didn't sign up. Where are you now, and why are you not doing this in a time when the pressure on cybercrime is increasing? And the Biden administration has signaled that some of these cyber crimes actually cross into the territory of casus belli, cause for war. Because if you're attacking some of the infrastructure and some of the really important stuff in a country, that's not a crime anymore. That has gone over the line. And so I think that this question of what constitutes a crime, where the line is to casus belli or cause of war, is one that's becoming more and more intense, which sort of provides a background against which you can understand the UN Convention, don't you think?
Exactly. I mean, on the face of it, this is a good thing in terms of strengthening the tools we've got to deal with these very, very serious sort of infrastructure-based attacks. And if I was sitting in the White House, I'd be being able to kind of make people in other countries who are carrying out these ransomware attacks on essential infrastructure feel nervous that they're going to get, locked up for long periods of time would be very high priority. And if I think they're in Russia, and I think that, this convention would be a way to make it so that the Russians would crack down on them and make it easier for me to extradite them, I should be all in favor of it. My nervousness is going to be, though, is this a sort of Trojan horse where they're going to come back and go, well, those opposition activists that you've got in your country, they're now carrying out a cybercrime, and I would like to have them extradited back to me in return. And so you can see, the bones of where this debate is going to be from a US or sort of Western perspective. What you want is every country in the world to crack down on what you perceive of as cyber criminals, people hacking your banks and financial systems and local authorities and health services and so on. What you're not going to want is to sign up to anything where you're agreeing to hand over people who are, from your point of view, expressing legitimate political interests, political opinions that are just unwelcome to people in another country. But again, huge amounts of judgment as to what's legitimate speech, what's illegitimate speech. We can never get away from it in these discussions, because that's where either this is going to succeed or founder. If there is the text of the treaty doesn't tell you what constitutes legitimate speech and illegitimate speech. That's something that governments have to understand of each other. And that's where I still think there is quite a big gap that needs to be closed before a treaty like this could be signed.
But it does validate one of the earlier predictions that we've made on our podcast, which is that we'll see more international collaboration rather than less. We'll see more treaties and institutions being built up. And I guess that if there's one advantage to the UN over the Council of Europe, is that the UN has institutional muscle in a way that the Council of Europe does not. And if there's anything I think is really important if you're going to put something like this in place, is that there is an institution that can carry it and enforce it, at least at a baseline level, so it doesn't just become a set of agreements that are interpreted differently in every single signatory country.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is a thing to watch. And it's interesting because we were sort of like looking back at the Budapest Convention, thinking about doing this classic text episode, was the first time I'd really spent a lot of time focused on the fact that there is this new UN process going on. And it's quite interesting just how something that is so material actually has not had a lot of coverage or engagement. It's not been very high on the agenda. And yet it's potentially hugely material. And again, that may reflect in part where it's come from, and a sort of sense that it's an odd thing out there that's come from the Russians, therefore we don't need to focus on it. But it's got a lot of support in the UN. A lot of countries did line up behind it. It's something we should definitely keep an eye on as we think about tech regulation.
And with that, I think we'll draw our conclusion and say that we've been discussing the Budapest Convention that celebrates 20 years since it was originally launched. I think it's a really interesting text. We'll link to it, I think, from our show notes. And you can find this podcast on your website, which is
www.regulate.tech.
Brilliant. If you have any questions, ideas, or if you have suggestions for other things you want us to talk about, don't hesitate to reach out. And as always, thank you so much for listening, and tune in next week.